Sega Genesis. Back in the day, this was the main competitor to the Super Nintendo. In fact, it was the only competitor that can hold its own ground. It was sleek, it had a good color, not like the gray and purple of the Super Nintendo. It had a headphone jack. Today, this doesn't seem like a big deal, but back in the day, when everyone was asleep and you were still gaming, you plugged in your headphones. At the time, this was revolutionary. The Sega Genesis was a great system, and a lot of people have stories about their first Sega Genesis. And so I thought I'd come here and share my story about my first Sega Genesis. It's a pretty funny story. But before I say any of that, it's important to say that, because it involves my father directly. And my father was the kind of person, and I still can't figure out why this is, he would promise me things and then never deliver. Even on his own, I wouldn't even ask for anything and he would still promise me things and then just let me down all the time. But this one day when I was a kid, we were watching TV and a Sega Genesis commercial popped on. And he asked me, he's like, isn't that what you have? I said, no, I have a Super Nintendo. I'd like a Sega Genesis. He goes, I'm going to get you one for your birthday. I said, okay, great. And my mom was there too at the time as well. And this is important to the story. So, a couple months pass and my birthday finally rolls around. And I'm waiting to receive a Sega Genesis. Nothing. I got nothing. My father was completely oblivious to the whole promise, and he was just acting like he didn't know what a Sega Genesis was. And I was very, very upset. Very. But I went to my mom, who was a witness that day, and I explained to her that I would like a Sega Genesis for my birthday. And she went and she backed me up, and finally we cornered my father into getting me a Sega Genesis. So we went to the shop. I believe it was like this small hole-in-the-wall video game shop. It was run by like this, I guess, Korean guy at the time. And we go in there and we ask for a Sega Genesis. And the guy comes out with the Sega, this nice big box. It looked great. And I think Altered Beast was gonna come with it. Gonna. Because that's not what I got. My father asks the guy if he has any used consoles. The guy says yeah. So he brings it out, because my father's a cheapskate. The guy brings out the other console, and he brings it up, and I look at it, and it looks fine. It looks like a regular Sega Genesis, right? So, of course he wants to go with that, and he's convincing me to take it, and me, I'm not trying to push my luck. I thought at the time I was lucky enough to even get one, after he said, you know, like I said, he doesn't really deliver on his promises. So, I go with it. But I also know that a used Sega Genesis is cheaper than a brand new one. He wanted to leave without even getting me a game. I was like, this makes absolutely no sense. You're getting me a game. So then I had to argue with him for him to buy me a game. Because what am I going to do with it? Stare at it? I have no video games for it. It's my first Genesis. So finally, I convinced him to get me a game. Finally. And he does, and that game was Sonic 2. At the time, Sonic was a big thing for Sega. You know, it was Sega's real mascot, and the sequel had just come out, and everyone was just talking about how great the sequel was and how great of a game it was. So I got it. And I went home with the Sonic 2 and the Sega Genesis. Got home, couldn't wait, plugged it in, and I started playing it. But then one of my cousins had also come over that day, and he was pretty psyched that I had a Sega Genesis. And to look at it, he picks it up, right, just regular. The whole half front faceplate of the Sega Genesis just falls off, and it hits the floor. Apparently, we didn't examine the system as well as we should have, and for some reason, the screws were missing from it. So the top could just directly come off the whole bottom, leaving the whole chips and innards just completely exposed. I was so angry when this happened, but my father refused to return it. He refused to return it. If it's not broke, don't fix it. So I was stuck with it, and it worked. But I was the only one who was allowed to handle it because I didn't want anybody else dropping it because it was so fragile. We never got any replacement screws for it at all. I was using that hand-me-down Sega Genesis for such a long time until I got a new one. I was just so fed up with it. But that didn't stop me. That didn't stop me from enjoying the Sega Genesis. The Genesis, granted, it wasn't, in my opinion anyway, as colorful as the Super Nintendo. The sound wasn't as amazing as the Super Nintendo. But if you could keep your eyes out, there were those high esteemed quality titles like Strider, like Castlevania Bloodlines, the Sonic games, the Vector Man games, the Toe Jam and Earl games, the Altered Beast game, Shinobi 3, Return of the Ninja Master. This was a pretty big game. In fact, I think they did this game over twice just to make sure it came out right and according to everybody's high standards at the time. So the Sega Genesis was just all around a great system, and I was very happy to have had so many great experiences with it, even though it was a hand-me-down piece of shit broken system at the time. At least mine was anyway. So that's the story, and I don't know. I hope no one else out there has a worse story than I do, because that's just sad. Till next time.